So let me first start by just telling you that this provocative title, the talk is not up to the provocative title, and that I really probably know very little about the things that you guys care about, but I'll do my best. The big conclusion. Let me start by saying this is really a work in progress that I am doing with Jose Caire of the University of Minnesota. Jose is just a really smashing grad student in comparative politics. He started at Purdue and went to Minnesota. And if you are ever looking for someone, a comparativist, the next couple of years, and his name winds up in the box, you should absolutely jump at the chance to get him. He is first class, and this project's a lot better because of him. This work is part of a larger project that I am involved in that thinks about the effects of exposure of information about terrorism and counterterrorism in the mass media. What happens when people see depictions of terrorism and counterterrorism in the media, and what does it do to them? The big conclusion that I'm going to talk to you about from this particular paper, and probably from the larger project as well, is that the media is much less helpful to perpetrators of terrorism than is generally supposed. That's the big takeaway line. And so if all you guys wanted to know what was this about, you can leave now.
Could you repeat it then?
Oh, I can't remember it. The media is much less helpful to perpetrators of terrorism than is generally supposed. Okay? The media does much less to advance the strategy of terrorism and the perpetrators of terrorism than is generally argued.
Can we go for coffee?
Yeah, exactly. Now you guys are out. You got me my tea. We're all set. So to figure out how I came about this conclusion, I want to start by taking you back to the night of September 24th, 2009. On that evening, millions of Americans and perhaps some Canadians tuned into ABC's World News Tonight, where they were treated to what we're calling the terrorism coverage trifecta. 3 different stories about terrorism back to back to back. Okay? So the first story was about... Did that move? Yeah. Okay, it didn't move on my screen. Okay. The first story was about the indictment of one of the 9/11 co-conspirators, Najibullah Zazi, by a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. Story number 2 was about a bomb plot that had been hatched in Illinois. And the third story was a breaking news item about an interrupted bomb plot that had taken place in Dallas, Texas. Bursts of coverage like this, where you get several stories in a row, are unusual on the nightly news, but they're definitely not unheard of. And what we figured out, based upon our review of the Vanderbilt Television Archive, is that for the past about 4 years, 2010 to 2014, one of the television networks in the United States, CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, I don't include Fox, one of the news networks showed a burst of coverage, 2 or more stories back to back, on average about once per month over this period, with some variation from year to year. 2010 was the most intense period of this burst coverage. 2012 was the least intense, but still you're getting roughly 1 story a month like this, one period of coverage like this a month. And this doesn't include, by the way, the nearly continuous coverage of terrorism that you would get during something like the Boston Marathon bomb. Okay, so these are literally discrete stories that happen repetitively or in sequence on a news broadcast. Okay, and so it raised the question for us, and the question that I want to talk to you about today that we thought through is really this one: what effects do bursts of terrorism coverage have on people's emotions and political attitudes? That is the big question of this research. Okay, so now I think I'm about to lose a couple of you already, wondering who invited me, where are the exits. Before that happens, let me take a second to really tell you why I think that this subject matter and this particular piece of research is something that you should pay attention to. And the basic issue is emotion. Terrorism is the ability to stimulate strong emotion is critical to the success of the strategy of terrorism. It doesn't work without it. Lots of people think that terrorism is really about violence, and it's not. Terrorism is a rather minor mortality risk for people. It's a pretty poor way to try to kill people. This is a graph that I put together based on data from the Global Terrorism Database, as well as from mortality statistics collected by the U.S. government, that compares fatalities from gun homicides in the United States to fatalities from terrorism worldwide. And we in the United States are killing more of ourselves in gun homicides on a yearly basis than all of the terrorist acts in the world are killing people around the world. Okay? And I can assure you that no one has suggested mobilizing the military to invade the city of Chicago to prevent this from happening. We are not spending hundreds of billions of dollars to deal with gun homicides. We're not invading other countries. We're not restricting civil liberties as a result. So why are we doing this? Well, it really is because of the capacity of acts of terrorism to stimulate strong emotional responses. The one that everybody knows about, or the ones that everybody knows about, are fear and anxiety. You know, of the 8,000 definitions of terrorism there are in the world, 75% of them mention fear as being a kind of core element to the strategy's success. Somewhat less well known is anger, an important element of every terrorist campaign. It's bad, isn't it?
Yeah. So bad it's good.
I would have had Rob Ford up here, but the guy's sick, and so that wouldn't be fair. But but he was definitely in the running. So these emotions are really important because they enable perpetrators to do something to injure targeted populations to an extent that perpetrators cannot do themselves. Okay, they essentially get societies to engage in some serious self-harm. And watching societies engage in this kind of self-harm is an encouragement to more terrorism. Okay. So really what the big perspective that I'm coming from suggests that dealing with the emotional consequences of terrorism is key to making it a much less attractive strategy for people to use. Okay. It makes it a lot easier, or it makes it a lot harder for perpetrators to think, we got him. We got him on the run. Okay. So you all familiar with some of the emotional responses to terrorism here in Canada, and if you've just lived through the federal election campaign here like I did, and I assume that most of you did, you know, of course, that the subject of the security-liberty trade-off was a big topic of discussion during the campaign. And it's pretty clear from a lot of research that anxiety about terrorism is what stimulates people who are normally protective of their liberties to start asking whether they need to place restrictions on them in order to deal with the threats that they pose. Bill C-51 is just kind of a poster child here for this kind of security-liberty trade-off, and it's really about the proper balance between being safe and being secure. That's one of the important ways this happens. Of course, I mean, if you kind of think back to the graph I put up a minute ago about the amount of violence that takes place in terrorism, you can kind of see that my perspective that this is probably an overreaction. We'll live through this, right? If we in the United States can live through all of those gun homicides, automobile deaths, deaths from peptic ulcers, heart attacks that happen every year, 8,000 deaths a year from terrorism is actually, it's a grim statistic, one that you don't want to have, but it's not something that's going to make the society fall to pieces. Anger fueled support in the United States for the tangentially related Iraq War. The U.S. goes to war in Iraq largely because of its alleged connection to 9/11. This is not really a very tight. There's not really a very tight connection between these two events. But people's anger at what happened, as Leonie Huddy and a bunch of her colleagues have shown, really increased people's appetite for striking out at those that were kind of remotely responsible in some way. We know from the actions of groups like the IRA and Hamas that trying to manipulate the anger of enemies is a tried and true tactic. You ultimately get security forces to kind of lose their minds and do something stupid, and that winds up rebounding to your advantage. So stimulating these kind of powerful emotions to get societies to do harm to themselves is critical to what's going on in a terrorist campaign. So where does the media come in? The media comes in terms of amplifying the actions of violence, the consequences of what is otherwise minor acts of violence. Groups are small. Terrorist organizations are small. They're typically poorly funded. ISIS isn't an exception, but they're typically small and poorly funded. They typically do not apply levels of force that are capable of intimidating hundreds of thousands of people, not like governments. So they need help. They need help making sure that their acts of force, uses of force, have their intended consequence. And this is where the mass media comes in. They, of course, are capable of beaming acts of violence and their kind of psychological effects into everybody's homes without very much trouble. So media is often kind of described as the oxygen of terrorism, the thing that terrorists actually need in order to have an impact. So the media obliges in this. The media are very, very commonly involved in depicting acts of terrorism to us. Typically, though, it does it one story at a time. Terrorism is not in the nightly news or in the newspaper every single day. It's there episodically. It's there a lot, but it's not an everyday story. But it's often, but that's the way we normally get it. Drip, drip, one at a time. Seeing presentations like this, we know from a lot of research, stimulates the negative emotions that we talked about. Being exposed to these kinds of images makes us more anxious, makes us more fearful, makes us angrier, may increase our disgust, may increase our sadness. Really, for the groups that are supposed to be targeted for intimidation by terrorism, terrorism has its intended consequence. It makes us feel a little bit lousy. All right. And it also, and as a consequence of these kinds of emotional responses, we have what are kind of predictable we wind up expressing kind of predictable political attitudes. Our foreign policy hawkishness increases, and our embrace of authoritarian attitudes, which can be kind of destructive of the fabric of democracy, increases. But what happens when the dose of terrorism coverage that the media delivers goes up? What happens when we get a stronger dose of terrorism coverage? On this question, it turns out there's a good deal of controversy. So on the one hand, we have people like Brigitte Nakos, John Mueller, Roxanne Silver and her co-authors, who argue that extended coverage or prolonged exposure to presentations about terrorism inflates the negative emotions that we have, and by implication intensifies the political attitudes that I've talked about: authoritarianism, foreign policy hawkishness, over what you would expect someone to experience if they only saw one story. But on the other side of this debate are a whole bunch of people who argue that prolonged exposure has a desensitizing effect on people's attitudes and emotions. We become inured to the presentations that we're seeing. So you see this kind of desensitization effect in work on exposure to information about casualties in war, Gardner and Segura. A bunch of other studies that kind of make this desensitization case that suggest that unfortunately, for better or for worse, becomes a kind of background condition that we learn to live with the more that we are exposed to it. Most of these studies, though, suffer from some severe limitations in terms of their internal validity. They are almost entirely observational studies, and they suffer from some well-known limitations. Number one, self-reports, people's self-reports about their use of media is notoriously inaccurate. It's not really clear why, whether they don't remember, whether they lie, but we don't really have a very, very firm reason for believing that when people say they watch television a lot or a little, that they're really giving us a kind of accurate quantity. Number two, this one's a little less well known, that exposure to terrorism coverage itself may be an effect of heightened emotions rather than the reverse. So when we feel when we feel threatened, when people feel threatened, psychologically, what our surveillance system is activated. In other words, the system that we have in our bodies to kind of scan the environment to try to figure out, okay, is there danger out there? Am I at risk? That is on, right? And we're looking to basically see, can I go out? Can I go to my poker game? What can I do here, right? And so a natural way for this to kind of manifest itself when people are feeling threatened is to turn to the media. So it's not at all that these negative displays make us feel more insecure or make us feel more negatively, emotionally. It's that we feel more negatively, and so we go and we read these accounts in the media. Neither of these problems are very, very well handled by the observational studies that are kind of in the literature. I can talk about later. So we decided that we could deal with these problems by taking an experimental approach to this question about prolonged terrorism coverage. We could waltz into a laboratory with a whole bunch of people and deal with a number of the problems that the observational studies have not been able to deal with. Number one, in the laboratory, we know exactly how much media attention, how much media coverage people are consuming. We go 9.5 minutes. We know that to the second. Maybe it's 9 minutes and 41 seconds. I don't remember. It's in the paper. But we know exactly how much media they're getting. And through the random assignment of people to conditions, we can also be quite sure, or as sure as one can be, is maybe a better way to put it, that it's not the people who already have heightened emotions that are being systematically exposed to media coverage, to the extended media coverage, right? So people with heightened emotions, people with depressed emotions, they've been mixed up in a random way. Some are going to be in our extended coverage group. Some are going to be in our baseline group, and whether they are in one or the other is random, not systematic. So we can deal with this problem of the effects of emotions in a way that observational studies cannot. So let me tell you a little about the basic setup here. We recruited 180 undergraduates from Purdue University, and we randomly assigned them into two groups of people, two experimental groups. A baseline group that saw only one video, this one, and a treatment group that saw this video plus 4 more. And this last one is notable. We'll talk about it later. It's a video. It's a security camera feed that ultimately depicts a woman who's kind of in the middle of the screen there, detonating a suicide vest. So it's a suicide bombing video, and it has some special consequences on our subjects. We selected these videos from a pool of 15 that we identified, And then we turn to Amazon.com's Mechanical Turk website. It's an online labor market, for those of you that don't know it. It's a great place to find people that will work for absolutely pennies. And social scientists have been exploiting it because we don't have a lot of money. And we asked these folks to rate the videos in terms of their scariness. And the 5 scariest videos that we found became the 5 videos that we used in our study. And we randomized the order of those videos to make sure there were no consistent ordering effects that our subjects would experience during the study. And then we showed it to them. When we were done, we administered a series of standard self-report items that are used in lots and lots of studies, mostly laboratory studies, but also surveys, to examine a number of issues. Number one, we examined people's anxiety about future attacks. We asked them questions about that. This is a kind of common measure in the literature on terrorism and the media. We administered something called the Profile of Mood States Questionnaire. Let me make sure this is important. This is a 37 item battery of questions that ask people about the moods they've been experiencing in the last 24 hours. And ultimately, these 37 items can be compressed into 6 dimensions, 6 kind of underlying mood dimensions. Those are depression, dejection, tension, anxiety, anger, hostility, fatigue, inertia, vigor, activity, and confusion, bewilderment. There will be no test later on this, but just so you know. Okay, so the POMS Profile of Mood States Questionnaire. We asked our subjects questions to get at their embrace of right-wing authoritarianism, following the questions that Merola and Zechmeister asked in their book, which I showed you before, Democracy at Risk. And we asked the questions that Shana Gadarian asked in her JOP article about foreign policy hawkishness.
This is all before they viewed the videos, right?
This is good question. Thank you. We did both before and after. So we asked about the profile of mood states both before and after. We asked there is a right-wing authoritarianism pre-test scale that we used, and then we used a post-test scale. That was before and after. We did not ask foreign policy hawkishness before. We did not ask about the risk of attacks before. We used the profile of mood, the before questions, just to ensure that we had experimental balance. That we didn't have the people with especially heightened emotions in one condition versus the other, and that we didn't have especially authoritarian personalities in one condition versus the other beforehand. We also took biometric measures of people's emotions. So this is a screenshot of the program we used called Face Reader, and this is what people that came to our lab looked like in real life. Well, not this guy. They're sitting there with headphones on, and this is a kind of the screenshot of them as they appear in the laboratory that they're in. And then the screen in the middle is a picture of what Face Reader is doing to them electronically, virtually. It's laying a mask over their faces, centered at the nose, and the mask measures, essentially gauges their facial reactions, microfacial reactions, at about 491 points on the face, nearly instantaneously. I believe Face Reader was giving us 3 measurements every 100 milliseconds or something like that. It's pretty rapid. The bottom part of the screen this is important for us. We won't be looking at this again, but this is the Valence Score. It's the valence of the emotion, the kind of the overall positivity or negativity of the emotions that people were experiencing, where valence is defined as the difference between those 2 kinds of emotions, positive versus negative. All right, so when you're down here, you're in the negative range. The microfacial reactions that are happening are more negative than they are positive, and the reverse when it's in this kind of positive range. Okay, we didn't look at individualized emotions. I'll explain why in just a minute. We could have looked at individualized emotions. This panel right here gives you a sense about face readers' take on what emotions people are experiencing and in what proportion. So it's hard to see, but I think this is probably neutral. This is a kind of neutral emotion, and then this is, I can't read it, so something bad. Actually, probably something good. He's smiling here. Okay. So the advantage of face reader for our purposes, there are two advantages. Number one, it gets out of the problem of dealing with unreliable self-reports about people's emotions. Right? People are known in laboratory settings, and maybe others, to provide reports about their own states that may be too optimistic or too negative or too pessimistic. Right? They might be trying to convince the researcher that they're doing a lot better than they really are. Right? Or they may be trying to play to what they think the researcher wants to hear, which is that they're scared to death. Right? So the self-reports have some unreliability to them that these biometric measures can help us get around. And the second thing that this does is it enables us to kind of gauge emotional reactions nearly continuously and instantaneously. Right? So the questionnaire format we have is cross-sectional. Right? You give them the test, you ask the question, then you go and you analyze the data afterwards. You can't really ask them at every 100 milliseconds, how you doing now? How you doing now? How you doing now? How you doing now? It just doesn't work. The face reader is based on Paul Ekman's work in the late 1970s on the facial action coding system. And Ekman's work, the premise of Ekman's work, by the way, for any of you that saw this movie Inside Out, he was a consultant on that movie for his expertise about emotion. So that's his credential. Now you'll believe it, right? Okay. So Ekman's work suggests that there are a set of finite and universal facial actions that people can take, given the muscles they have in their faces, and that these facial actions are a reasonably reliable guide to people's emotional states. So this is an example of the facial action coding system applied to someone who is showing fear on their face. Right? So the eyebrows are raised and pulled together, raised upper eyelid, tense lower eyelid, lips slightly stretched horizontally back towards the ears. Okay, these are the kinds of things that a trained human coder would go through looking at each individual picture or frame to try to decide, well, what's this person feeling right now? Are they afraid? Are they happy? Are they disgusted? Are they sad? Ekman's work further argues that there are kind of 6 kind of basic emotions that are universal that people display on their faces, and there's a reasonable amount of evidence in favor of this particular position. Now, why did we use, let me just kind of circle back for a second, why did we use the Valence Score instead of the individual emotion scores? And the answer is that while Face Reader is a reliable tool, it does a very good job. It's very close in its judgments about people's emotions to people who are trained in the facial action coding system, human trained coders. When it makes errors, and it does make errors, the errors it makes tend to be in the proper direction. So it might mistake disgust for fear or fear for sadness, but it doesn't usually mistake disgust for happiness. So what we decided was that we would do a lot better. We'd feel more confident in the reliability of our results if we threw away some of that error by basically condensing the result into what was either positive or negative. We don't really have strong predictions about any individual emotions anyway. We would get more robust and more reliable results by doing that. So that's really the reason for the focus on the Valence scores. So what did we find? Here's a quick summary. Big picture, people who were exposed to the 5 videos experienced more intense emotions and greater sense of vulnerability than people that only saw 1 video. But at the micro level, we watched a trajectory of recovery or desensitization. So yeah, people took a kind of a big hit. This was a lot for them to absorb. But the valence of their responses was increasingly positive as their exposure continued. The third thing we found was that the quality of the videos that they saw, I don't mean like the clarity, but I mean like the kind of what they were displaying. The video quality and the order of presentation mattered. We think that this means that, number one, bursts of terrorism coverage don't have one effect. They have two dueling effects. Okay? Essentially, both the desensitization argument and the inflation argument are right. Both things happen at the same time. Okay. But the quality and organization of presentation are influential variables that's really not being considered in the literature on media effects of terrorism right now. Right now, it's really almost all about the extent to which there is exposure, not what is the kind of exposure that people are getting or the sequence of the exposure that they're getting. So let me run through these results. These are the macro results. These are the ones that we got on the basis of our self-reports at the end of the study. Number one, people's anger hostility dimension increased. Okay, on the PALM scale, people became more angry than they were before they started than they were in the baseline group. Tension and anxiety increased. Both of these are kind of the consistent kinds of responses that we see from exposure to terrorism material, right? And it makes some more sense. Like, why would people's vigor increase? I don't know, right? And it didn't. People's sense about the threat of attack against the United States, which has widely been used as a measure of their underlying anxiety, this also increased the more videos that they saw. We found no effect, though, on right-wing authoritarianism or foreign policy hawkishness. The micro results that I'm going to present are all based on the face reader data that we gathered. Biometric data showed no difference in average valence scores between the baseline and treatment groups. But we found systematic variation in the valence scores within the prolonged exposure condition. And in fact, what I'm going to tell you is that controlling for the specific video that people watched, the average valence score of those in the experimental group for the fifth exposure was 50% less negative than the average valence score for the first exposure. It's a huge drop. Okay. This is the pattern that we saw with 3 of the 5 videos that we presented people. Okay, so estimated valence, right? More negative is you go from negative to positive, essentially. The video number 1, this video was used in a study by Breckenridge Zimbardo in Sweden of a bus bombing in Israel. If people saw this first, if this was the first video they saw, they had the most negative reaction to it right here. Right? And these bars represent the kind of variance. Okay. Every place that it moves from first to fifth, you get some movement in the positive direction about people's response to it. Okay. So over here, in the 5th, we're actually getting positive responses to this video. People feel pretty good about it. The second big pattern that we saw was the pattern with this video I told you about a few minutes ago, the suicide terrorism video. This one had exactly the opposite pattern. People got more positive about it earlier in the presentation. So it goes, instead of getting more positive first to fifth, it gets more positive fifth to first. Okay, we had no idea what to make of this. We were prepared for no effect. We were prepared for the effect that we saw, where people got progressively more desensitized to the exposure. This one did not make sense. So we're still thinking about it, and I'll be pleased for your suggestions. What we think is going on, what I think is going on, I haven't run this by Jose yet, so I'm not going to tie him to this particular assertion. But what I think is going on, what I think this is showing, is that while overall people are becoming more desensitized to the presentations that they're getting, their ability to withstand big shocks is becoming more fragile. It's almost like their emotional resources are getting depleted. So when you show them videos that kind of have a consistent level of threat in them, people can handle that. They're increasingly better at handling that as the number of presentations increases. But then you throw them something like this video, where in the middle, all hell breaks loose, totally unexpectedly, really surprising. They can't hack it. And the more videos they've seen beforehand, the worse it gets. So let me give you a sense of what I mean by all hell breaks loose in this video. As you can see in this picture, this is like the image quality. It's grainy. It's hard to see. The first time you're watching, you're like, what the hell is this? You know, you're looking at it, you're like, what is happening here? And then all of a sudden, this gal blows herself up, and this you're like, whoa, what just happened there? Right? That is like totally shocking. And this is, we looked at the second-by-second responses that people had to this video to try to confirm what we were thinking was going on. And in fact, it really did. So what you're seeing here is that these are the valence scores that we were recording for people by second for video 5. And initially there's a drop as people start to watch the video, and they're kind of, they're probably confused. What's this? But after about second 20, it flattens out. Maybe goes up a little bit, but it's essentially a flat line until this dotted line at like second 75. That's where she pulls the trigger. Right? And the video then repeats the image of her blowing herself up over and over and over again for several seconds. And this is really just too much. People's valence scores fall off the table. They drop precipitously. This drop, we have no other video that produced valence scores as low as this one, by far the lowest. And the drop between the kind of the explosion and the end of the video is probably the steepest that we've seen in any of the videos that we've got. Yes?
Out of the 5 videos, was that the only one with the suicide bombing?
Yes.
So did you ever think of maybe having another video with suicide bombing and maybe seeing if it's really just that video or just in general suicide bombing?
We have not done that. That's an interesting idea. No, we haven't done it yet. But yeah, I think that's what's going on, but I don't know. It would be interesting to see. I suspect that if I showed people 5 suicide bombing videos, that I would reverse the thing that I saw before. Eventually, I would get this kind of desensitization pattern again. But I don't know that for sure. I didn't predict this. Yes, ma'am.
Just right on that same. I know we're not doing questions yet. But
Questions are great.
If that's the only. I don't want to interrupt, but if that's the only female that they see killed in these.
That is a really good question, and I don't. It probably is the only person that they see killed because they don't necessarily see anyone else that's been killed. I mean, in the bus bombing video, there are people that are laid out and they're bloodied. And it's not exactly clear. There are a bunch of men in there. There may be some women. No one is dead. But this
video that she's a female and that's what they're.
Yeah, it is clear. It is clear that she's a female. It is clear that she blows herself across the room. I mean, it is dramatic. But we didn't expect, I should just say, one of the reasons why we didn't expect this video to produce this result is that this video, didn't even rate as the scariest video in the pack that we had. So we weren't prepared for it. I mean, like
in the find scary.
I asked people basically how rate this on a scale of 1 to 10. How scary is this video? Something I think that was the. It wasn't. No, it was literally where not scary at all to made me pee my pants. I don't know. I mean, I don't remember what the scale was, but that's going to be on the tape, right? Damn. Okay. Maybe someone will go in and clean it up. I don't remember exactly what the text is. I have the question. I can get it for you, but essentially it was on a scale of 1 to 10. Yeah.
Was that the only video that was like the incident as it unfolded? Were all the others post-incident?
All the others were post-incident. And some of them don't even actually show an incident. Some of them basically talk about a looming threat. I don't have it, but one of the video that we used that Shana Gadarian used in her work, talks about a looming threat that shows no images of an actual attack. There is one of an attack in either Lebanon or Bulgaria. I can't remember which one it is, where the reporter goes right by the kind of the burning remains of something that had literally, obviously just, or at least they want you to think, obviously just exploded. But no, you don't. We don't see this happening in real time.
Okay.
Okay. So this made us think, oh, well, what would happen if we were to think about those people that saw this video first and some videos like it, right, rather than last? And here what we found was that when you saw this video first, it sped up the desensitization process with the rest. Right? Everything else was just like, give me a break. Right? Find something shocking to show me. So when we dropped this video on people, really made a difference. Dropped it at the beginning, everything else seems easy. Dropped it at the end, people don't have time to recover. I'm going to do this real quick in the interest of time here. So let me just kind of highlight the big points here. We're seeing dueling effects of prolonged exposure. We're seeing on the one hand inflation of emotions and attitudes. On the other hand, we're seeing desensitization at the same time. They're happening at the same time. People, we think, are less susceptible, they're becoming desensitized to standard presentations of terrorism, but things that are really off-the-wall shocking, they can't handle. Right? They become more susceptible to really shocking ones. Quality and order of the material is really important. Some videos hasten desensitization when shown first, and they totally undermine it when shown last. The same videos. It's all about the sequence. Okay. And I want to leave you with the kind of conclusion that I started with in the beginning. Lots of people say that the way to deal with the mass-mediated effects of terrorism, right, to basically deal with the threat, the problem that terrorism poses our societies, is to turn the television off. Right? Stop watching the news. And our research is saying something different. Our research says that in some circumstances, the best advice is to leave the news on. Thank you. We'll take questions.